This conference will now be recorded.
So let's go. This is the last course of the Introduction to Cognitive Science courses of the NSU. We started 2 months ago on the history of concepts in cognitive science, and we will close on the epistemology of cognitive science. The question asked here is what is the relation between how we study psychology? This is a pretty pressing question because of the culture war between sociology and some fringes, some people in sociology and some people in psychology who insist that essentially sociology should be framed in the terms of cognitive science, in terms of cognitive bias and mechanisms. So the question we are asking now is, can cognitive mechanisms, as studied in the lab, explain ecological behavior of humans? The first question we are going to ask to answer this is, what are cognitive science? Cognitive science has originated as an offspring and a rebellious offspring of behaviorism, which is a current in psychology which embodied the positivist epistemological approach, which postulated that behavior is determined and explained by regularities that have the status of natural law, and that they should be studied from the association in the lab of stimulus and response in experimental settings, and that we should specifically not speculate on this matter of what happens within an agent's head. Cognitivism and thereafter post-cognitivism took the exact opposite stance. It considered that it is mental activity that drives behavior, and we should specifically use experimental methods to study mental activities and to study the physical architecture which enables it, and to study how actually we humans process information through our behavior. This gives kind of different inference architecture from behaviorism, because we still try to see how subjects respond to stimuluses, but now we consider that there are things which are called representations or mechanisms that have some kind of mediating causal role in it. The characterization I used of cognitivism and post-cognitivism is pretty wide, and it embodies very different currents within cognitive science. What we need to understand is that cognitive science developed in a joint way to computer science. And historical proponents of cognitive science, they thought that the brain works like a computer works. So by formal computational operations on symbolic things. We have mostly moved away from this idea now, and most cognitive scientists, at least in computational and neuroscientific branches of cognitive science, consider that the brain and agents are mostly dynamical systems. So they are things that can move in some space, and it is the movement of neurons and of agents which structures cognition. So now we have the beginning of a grasp regarding what is cognitive science, and we'll get to the meat of the lecture. We will proceed in 4 steps. The first will be talk about how we study cognitive architecture in experimental settings. The second is to see how we can try to scale cognition from the laboratory to the ecological settings of humans. And the third is how we can actually study human activity in the wild. And then we will synthesize what we said in a short and relevant way. Sorry about this. So let's proceed. The first thing we'll do is to try to see how we study cognitive architecture in the context of experimental stimulus-response settings. The first question is, how does cognitive psychology work? I've essentially answered this already. We cognitive psychologists use pretty much the same inferential settings as behaviorists did. They take a subject, they bring him to a laboratory where we can control essentially all that he sees and reacts to, and we present him to a specific stimuli, and we try to measure the quality, the regularities in their answer, and we hypothesize cognitive mechanisms or representation from what regularities we observe, and we consider, most importantly, that these regularities are what characterize a cognitive mechanism. This is the same thing that I presented above, so you must be familiar with this graph. And what is pretty important is that we almost always study humans in individual settings, and we almost always study them in controlled experimental settings. And the assumption we make for this to explain basically anything is that the regularities we see in the lab have the status of law. They are explanatory regularities. And most of the explanatory power of cognitive psychology regarding ecological behavior, it hinges on the idea that cognitive mechanism will ground and explain and motivate these regularities. And as cognitive mechanism do not or should not change as soon as you leave a room, then we think these regularities hold in the wild. The problem is, it is more complicated than that. And we will see first what are the arguments to believe that cognitive mechanisms are actually individuated. They are characterized fully by their functions, so the regularities they underlie. As far as I know, only theory that tries to justify this assumption is the theory called in cognitive psychology and evolutionary anthropology massive modularism. The idea of massive modularism is that all or nearly all cognitive mechanisms, at least all that are relevant to our studies, they are adaptation in the evolutionary sense. So they are traits, biological traits, which were developed specifically due to selection. And not only they are adaptations, but they're adaptations for very specific problems, and they only act when they are presented to conditions which resemble those of this problem. So this is called domain specificity. So if we assume that cognitive mechanisms were all or nearly all selected for specific ecological function sometime in the deep evolutionary past of humans, and if we assume that they kept their function through time, then we can conclude that mechanisms have pretty well-defined activation conditions and pretty well-defined stimulus-response law, and then the assumption, the bridging assumption between what humans do in the lab and what they do in the wild is justified. This theory is mostly used in the explanation of cultural regularities between and in the study of the content of culture and how it varies, and contrarily how it doesn't vary between culture. An example is the idea that because humans are very interested in faces due to their hard-coded cognitive architecture, then we have high cultural stability of cultural items that mimic faces. So that, in this way, that universal cognitive architecture can explain, social behavior, social traits. The issue with this idea of massive modularism is that there is, in fact, no grounding whatsoever to the idea that we could or should try to match cognitive mechanisms to specific functions. I will discriminate between two types of functions. The first is evolutionary function, so what it was selected for. And the second is ecological function, what it actually does. For the first, there is nothing in biology which says that every trait is individuated by its ancestral functions. We positively know that some traits are not specially adaptive. We positively know that sometimes and often traits that emerge from a function become co-opted for some other function. And we mostly know that the possibility for selecting adaptive traits, it critically relies on the existence of very robust developmental processes. So there is nearly no scenario where the structure of a trait can cleanly be explained by its function. I'm not aware of any documented case where we could convincingly argue that this is the case. The second function we discussed is ecological function. So how we can match mechanism to what it does. So we have brain parts and we do things because our brain parts interact. There is no grounding whatsoever to the idea that a specific brain part or a specific structure within the brain may explain specific behavior because these dynamics emerge. There are things that we do, and these things typically rely on a lot of cognitive structure. They rely on co-opting different structure in different way to work. And this is a well-documented thing that we have in cognitive neuroscience. So there is no grounding either to the idea that a specific mechanism could, would, or should cause a specific behavior. What we do in cognitive neuroscience, instead of saying that we have universal mechanisms that cause the same behavior always, all of the time, is to use three convergent and codependent methods of analysis. The first is decomposition. So when we talk of mechanisms, we talk of things that are structured, that have subparts. And these subparts, do specific things within the mechanisms. So we first try to identify what are the parts and what they do. The second method is composition. Once we have a clear idea of what the parts do, we try to see how they are assembled and how this structure makes the system behave as a whole. And we model computationally what the mechanism does. And when we have this, we use situation, which is to inject this model of cognitive mechanism into specific ecological settings, and its coupled dynamics with ecological settings will now actually explain and predict behavior. So now that we have this core idea of how explanation in cognitive neuroscience work, the question is, how can we scale cognition from the lab to the wild? The first thing we need to look at in this scaling thing is actually what is the architecture of the brain, like the physical thing that is in our head. This is a picture displaying the structural and functional architecture of the brain. You do not need to understand what is the difference between structural and functional brain networks. What is important is that these are complementary pictures of how the brain is structured. What we see in those graphs is red squares. red squares are regions not necessarily situated in a specific place of the brain, but there are subsets of the brain which are well connected between them. And in those red squares, you have smaller, redder squares. And in those smaller, redder squares, you have smaller, redder squares. This is a hierarchical fractal architecture. You have modules, you have parts of the brain which work in somewhat integrated ways, and in those modules you have some modules, etc., 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 done to the scale of individual neurons. And what is very interesting to contemplate when you are a physicist is the fact that this structure critically depends on the homeostasis, on the chemical balance of the brain, and the brain does self-organize toward maintaining this scale invariance in architecture. And this allows the brain to do cognition because this complex architecture allows it to embody complex information in its structure, and the endogenous spontaneous activity of the brain encodes information that is what cognition is about. And it's, how to say this clearly? The information is embodied not in some kind of reactive representation, but it's embodied in the way the neurons fluctuate. So you have both rich information integration within the brain and wild, pretty hard to characterize statistically, fluctuations in how it behaves when it is not perturbed. Now we will try to look more precisely at what this complicated self-organization means for how cognitive systems behave. The first thing we need to understand is what it means when complex organization emerge in physical systems. Complex organization, it maps pretty clearly on the notion of symmetry breaking. Physicists talk of symmetry breaking when a system self-organizes into a state whose features do not traduce the physical symmetries of what his environment is. The simplest possible case of this is convection cells. When you heat water, you have a strong symmetry of how the water is heated. For example, if you have electric heater, it will homogeneously heat the bottom of your pan. But what will emerge within the pan is not symmetrical. You will have loops of hot water coming up and then refrigerating at the contact of air and then coming down. And you will have symmetry breaking, which will be organized toward the dissipation of heat from the bottom of your pan, which is heated, to the world, the wider world. And what is possibly the most important thing you can understand about living systems is that they spontaneously break symmetries all the time. And they do not simply break symmetries into low entropy structures like the conventional cells. They can amplify noise at a very small level, either quantum or thermal, into structures that are embodied between scales in their physical organization, and they can integrate these structures within their structural identity, within the set of constraints that define them. What this means is that due to the way they are organized and maintain themselves very far from physical equilibrium, because they eat, simply, they can recreate their structure continuously, and they can transmit what structure they embody through their lifetimes and through generation. This is a property that we will call either self-regeneration or autopoiesis, which is the Greek for that. So let's ask a weird question. We saw that the brain bioresonates, and this explains cognition, but also it makes the brain very difficult to study cleanly. What about social systems? Do social systems display bioresonance? Yes, social systems display bioresonance. This is pretty hard to justify, actually, because how obvious it is. Human societies, they have skeletal structures. You have neighborhoods, you have families within neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are organized within cities, which are organized within networks of cities. This is what scale invariance is. And we have very strong results that show that this structure is necessary and enable the evolution of complex cultural traits on which human cognition is grounded. So yes, social systems display their resonance. Yes, they are able to creatively rebuild their structure all the time, depending on universal condition. And yes, this is inheritable through time in social systems. They basically have all of the properties that characterize brains. And not only this, but the way these properties build cultural variants, cultural traits, it constrains and enables the development of individual human cognition because it shapes what humans see, and what they can infer from their environment and what is this environment to begin with. So creative evolution by resonance in social systems does not only exist, but builds individual human cognition. It is not something we can ignore while studying cognition. So to answer our core question, how can we infer in eco-cognition from individual behavior? The answer is basically that you cannot, at least based on a set of naive strategies of inference that will come to your mind intuitively if you try to study things. This is true because human cognition, be it within an individual in his brain or across individuals in societies, they display three important things, which are scale invariant physical structure, which is wild dynamics, very variant dynamics, and which is an ability for creative evolution to find new solutions to problems and embody them. If I try to infer future behavior from the observation of past behavior, creative evolution and in a recurrent extent wild dynamics, it implies that you have phenomenon which is called physically ergosity breaking, and which basically means that the system will not revisit the same states regularly. So it does not have clean statistical properties that could be inferred from its observation through time. So we will not infer the behavior of cognitive system from its past behavior. This is not going to happen. The second kind of inference you could make is to study a human in the lab, and to try to extrapolate what you saw in the lab to the wild. The thing is, social systems display wild dynamics, and it does not reduce to any model of individual humans. So I'm mixing things. So wild dynamics in human cognition means that human behavior is dependent from a very small and total cues. It has a high coefficient of Lyapunov, formally speaking, and its behavior, when it's exposed to specific stimuluses in specific contexts, is not the same that it will be when exposed to the same stimuluses in a different context when he has different expectations. So you cannot cleanly infer in the wild behavior from in-lab behavior. And the last thing you could try to infer is to build models of individual cognition from lab data and to scale it with models to collective cognition. And this does not work because social systems have a scale invariant structure, and this clearly, self-evidently means that you do not have simple emergence from individual behavior to collective behavior. You do not have a determination of collective dynamics by individual properties. So you do not have scaling of your cognitive models. So can we do cognitive science? No. The answer is yes, we can. We can even do cognitive science about human societies and this work, but we will need to use tools that are dimensioned for this. And now we are going to talk about those tools. The first thing there is to understand is that complexity in the world, it is not just networks. It's not just simple models that do simple things. You have a property that is called very simply organization, which is typical of living systems. I do not think I am surprising you by saying living systems are organized. And this organization, it is both present at all scales, from your small organoids, like the functional substructure of the cells, to big cities. You have structure across scales. And this structure, it is not replaceable by anything that looks like it. It is actually what makes the system behave as it does. And it is not reducible to individual properties of its components. So it is not reducible to what we could call bottom-up emergence. And when this is not an issue to the natural sciences, but what natural scientists do when confronted with organized complex systems is not to try to have a very good model of quantum mechanics and predict how the currents will work from quantum mechanics. What they do is to look at a specific system, to look at how it's organized, to build models of what causal relations build it, and to integrate those models into a good understanding of these systems and what it does. It is not especially complicated. This is what needs to be done if you want to understand living things. The thing is that because organizations present across scale human societies, we need to account for how it impacts collective cognition. And the most important insight there is to be had here is the fact that cognition, it is not just neurons that fluctuate. It is embodied in the way that organisms alter their environment. There is a process called niche construction by which agents, evolutionary agents, will alter their environment so as to fit their needs, like castors built, how do you say? I don't have the word. Things that retain water because they needed to survive. The thing is, by building things into the world, cognitive agents, they also build a landscape of affordances, of things that they perceive can be done. And this process will alter their cognition, and this process, therefore, is a component of cognition. So the material architecture of human societies, it is not a result of human cognition, it is an instance of human cognition. It embodies cognitive attitudes that are present at the systems scale. And the most basic thing you could say about cognition to reconcile it to this physical perspective I'm articulating here is the fact that it's grounded in adaptive coupling. You have systems which have environments, and those systems will interact with those environments. And this interaction, when you have a system that is cognitive, that is able to embody information adaptively, is the grounding of what we call cognition. The fact that we have a bridge, and it is not made in flesh, it is not made in neurons, does not alter the cognitive quality of this structure if we are to look at systems behavior. And because of this, we cannot limit the study of cognition to the study of individual agents. We, as individual agents, participate in collective agency. I will explain now what it means. You have a process in evolutionary biology which is called evolutionary transitions. And this process is the process by which new entity of evolutionary individuality emerge, like multicellular organisms. And this process is characterized by a lot of things actually, but it's mainly characterized as two things, which is the emergence of very strong in-group cooperation and the emergence of new evolutionary inheritance, new ways to pass on information that determines phenotype. We humans have strong in-group cooperation and we have language and culture to pass. So it's pretty clear that human societies at some scale are the result of evolutionary transition. I don't think anyone has ever argued against that, and they would have a weak case, so I won't pass on this. What I would say is that we have a specific scale which we can say, we can speculate, we can infer is a relevant scale of human agency, which is the city-states. So city-states, by this I mean the historical entities which are organized as dense urban settlements with a state, so central administrative control from an elite class. And this structure, it displays all of the features of evolutionary transition. It is based on a form of hardcore cooperation, which is basically taxating peasants, the taxation of peasants, in the case where they have enough rich resources to be taxed. And this allows a strong level of functional specialization into specific economic cognitive niches. And importantly, this process is critically grounded, at least has been critically shaped by new inheritance systems, which is writing, which allows centralized administrative control, which allows debt, which allows taxation, which allows conscription, which allows any single thing you could think of that is somehow cited to modern societies. So, although it is not clear what scales are relevant here and now, when we have a lot of states that encompass several cities, it is not even clear that we can distinguish a single scale at which agency happens. It is very clear that the structural constraints that determine city-states are as relevant to studying human cognition that the constraints that characterize individual human behavior. This is not a negation of cognitive science. In fact, this is an affirmation of cognitive science, because we can very well study cognition across scales. Maybe the most advanced theoretical attempt to do this we'll call an active rational inference. The core argument of this line of research, which was formalized by Carl Friston, a very famous guy for this, is that if you define dynamical systems, any kind of dynamical systems, and that within this dynamical system you have a subpart which is itself dynamical systems and which is somewhat bounded, which is somewhat isolated from what happens in the rest of the system. Then this part will self-organize to minimize what is technically called their variational free energy, and which is somewhat more intuitively a prediction of how stable is its state of organization given the states of environment, and which is very intuitively but very strangely basically evidence for the model that is embodied within these chemical systems. This core process is a grounding of cognition. It is proposed as the core reason why brains cognite. Pretty convincingly, I think. At least a lot of people are in it. And very importantly, this theory is scale invariant. It does not apply to any specific scale. It applies to the relation of a chemical system to its environment. And because of it, it entails the formation of nested agency in cognitive systems, like neurons within neural networks, neuron communities within wider neural networks, neural networks in the whole brain, humans in society. All of these scales, if they are sufficiently bounded, will self-organize so as to preserve and recreate their structural identity. And this will cause them to embody information of the world because they will adopt the structure that is most relevant to what they have to do given the context. And this process, which is properly cognitive, it's a process of inference, formally speaking, it occurs across scales in living systems, and it grounds, it explains how they're organized in nested structures with organization within organization within organization within organization. So this was dense. We'll now try to articulate a series of small, relevant, up to the point, take-home messages. The first message you should try to integrate is that human cognition is embedded within social networks. It does not happen in the void. And those social networks, they have properties, dynamical properties, that are not explained per se by individual human cognition. And to have a better grasp of what it means to work as a network, what those cognitive dynamics in networks mean, I suggest you take a look at this educational game I linked that there is as a picture on the screen you are looking at, because it's extremely good and it shows how complex structure constrains and creates emerging social behavior. The second take-home message is that cognition, it's creative. It's a form of creative evolution. Cognition is the process by which living systems, any living systems, it actively builds meaning, it builds a model of its world. It does so through its own means. And by doing so, it continuously recreates its own structural identity. And this process of creation is not bounded. It is not predetermined physically. It's open-ended. You do not know where this will go. And because of this, we cannot say that things that are outside us and shape our cognition are not part of our cognition. The way human cognite is the way human integrates information about the world. Whether it involves, I don't know, an axe, a chair, augmented reality, city-states, I don't know. These are part of cognitive science and can be studied with the tools of cognitive science. And the last thing is actually getting back to the actual point of this presentation, which is the epistemology of cognitive science, is that science also is built into loops of meaning. Research does not happen in the void. It's coupled to wider social cognitive dynamics. It's coupled because scientists do not occur in the void. They are shaped by the society they live in. They embody folk knowledge about the world when they try to science things. And research, it builds meaning about the world that is embodied in wider society. This is pretty clear to anyone who is interested in how scientific research has shaped historical domination systems, but basically, we act on science. If we believe that, I don't know, taxation is bad, we'll stop taxation. That's as simple as it is. And the process by which humans understand the world through science, it depends on models, on scientific models. And the property of scientific models that can be understood and used as a tool in understanding and manipulating the world imply that these models are stylized. They need to be simple enough to be legible to the human mind. And this is not a problem because this is actually how natural sciences occur naturally when it works. We build models that we try to use to understand actual dynamics, and it loops. And if we do that, and if we try to engage with whether societies were doing that, we are collecting meaningful information, and we are bringing the wider society to meaningful information about the world we live in. And this is actually the core idea that is driving the Kairos Research Lab, which I am participating in, and that explains our symbol, which is an active loop, which is this loop of meaning by which embodied agents try to build meaning about the world in order to maintain adaptive coupling with our environment. So, thank you for having listened to me. You have lots of references, like 50 or 60 of them, which you can individually look at if you feel like it after this conference. I will now be taking questions if anyone has them. I prefer them to be formulated in English, but this does not matter a lot, actually. Just wait that I put my ears on. Here we go.
Okay, so I have a question about. Could you go back on to slide 8?
8.
Like the full one. Okay. I absolutely didn't understood what you meant by I don't know what was the sentence. I forgot, but you said something like neurons fluctuate, and I don't know what it is.
What it is, fluctuate?
What those neuron fluctuates mean? What it is like?
What it is like for a neuron to fluctuate?
Yeah.
It does things, like it does a non-static activity. That is what it means to fluctuate.
So it means like a higher energy and a lower. No, I don't know what. Like it's more activity from the neurons, and then less activity, and then more.
Fluctuation can be used to describe any kind of chemical activity that is endogenous to a system.
Okay.
So when I say neurons fluctuate, what it means is that the brain has a non-equilibrium activity. Like if you leave the brain alone, it will do things, it will fluctuate, it will resonate with itself and do cognitive stuff, even though it is not stimulated.
Okay. I get it.
No other questions? No comments of any kind?
I guess you could have maybe spent a little more time on an activism, but I guess it's just time that forces you to not to do it. But yeah, that's all.
And activism is pretty much its own thing, so I cannot dedicate more time to it without changing the topic, which is epistemology and physics of cognition.
Yeah, I know. It's like, okay, that was frustrating, but it's normal, I guess.
It's your topic, and you can you can talk about cognition and actually only what I want. So if no one has questions or comments of any kind, I will cut the sense here and say goodbye. Does this sound good?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening. See you.